The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 9, Side 1. Corinna deceives him in his turn, and he is furious on finding that she holds her favors insufficiently rewarded by the homage of his verse. She kisses him into forgiveness, but he cannot pardon the new skill of her loving. Some other master has been teaching her. A few pages later, he is in love with two maids at once, each beautiful, each tasteful in dress and accomplishment. Soon, he fears, his simultaneous duties will undo him, but he will be happy to die on the field of love. These poems were tolerantly received by Roman society 4 years after the passing of the Julian reform laws. Great senatorial families like the Fabii, the Corvini, the Pomponii continued to entertain Ovid in their homes. Buoyant with success, the poet issued a manual of seduction called Ars Amatoria, this in 2 B.C. "I have been appointed by Venus," he says, "as tutor to tender love." He chastely warns readers that his precepts must be applied only to courtesans and slaves. But his pictures of whispered confidences, secret assignations, billets doux, raillery and wit, deceived husbands, and resourceful handmaids suggest the middle and upper classes of Rome. Lest his lessons should prove too apt, he added another treatise, Remedia Amoris, on curing love. The best remedy is hard work, next, hunting, third, absence. It is also useful to surprise your lady in the morning before she has completed her toilette. Finally, to make the balance even, he wrote De Medicamina Faciei Femininae, a metrical manual of cosmetics pilfered from the Greeks. These little volumes sold so well that Ovid soared to heights of insolent fame. "So long as I am celebrated all the world over, it matters not to me what one or two pettifoggers say about me." He did not know that one of these pettifoggers was Augustus, that the prince resented his poems as an insult to the Julian laws, and would not forget the insult when imperial scandal should touch the poet's careless head. About the 3rd year of our era, Ovid married a 3rd time. His new wife belonged to one of the most distinguished families in Rome. Now 46, the poet settled down to domestic life and seems to have lived in mutual faith and happiness with Fabia. Age did to him what law could not. It cooled his fires and made his poetry respectable. In the Heroides, he told again the love stories of famous women, Penelope, Phaedra, Dido, Ariadne, Sappho, Helen, Hero. Told them perhaps at too great length, for repetition can make even love a bore. Startling, however, is a sentence in which Phaedra expresses Ovid's philosophy. "Jove decreed that virtue is whatever brings us pleasure." About AD 7, the poet published his greatest work, the Metamorphoses. These 15 books recounted in engaging hexameters the renowned transformations of inanimate objects, animals, mortals, and gods. Since almost everything in Greek and Roman legend changed its form, the scheme permitted Ovid to range through the whole realm of classical mythology, from the creation of the world to the deification of Caesar. These are the old tales that until a generation ago were de rigueur in every college, and whose memory has not yet been erased by the revolution of our time. Phaethon's chariot, Pyramus and Thisbe, Perseus and Andromeda, the rape of Proserpine, Arethusa, Medea, Daedalus and Icarus, Baucis and Philemon, Orpheus and Eurydice, Atalanta, Venus and Adonis, and many more. Here is the treasury from which 100,000 poems, paintings, and statues have taken their themes. If one must still learn the old myths, there is no more painless way than by reading this kaleidoscope of men and gods, stories told with skeptical humor and amorous bent, and worked up with such patient art as no mere trifler could ever have achieved. Little wonder that at the end the confident poet announced his own immortality. Per secula omnia vivam, I shall live forever. He had hardly written the words when news came that Augustus had banished him to cold and barbarous Tomi on the Black Sea, even today unalluring as Constanta. It was a blow for which the poet, rounding 51, was wholly unprepared. He had just composed, toward the close of the Metamorphoses, an elegant tribute to the emperor, whose statesmanship he now recognized as the source of that peace, security, and luxury which Ovid's generation had enjoyed. He had half completed, under the title of Fasti, an almost pious poem celebrating the religious feasts of the Roman year. In these verses he was on the way to make an epic out of a calendar, for he applied to the tales of the old religion and to the honoring of its shrines and gods the same lucid facility, delicacy of word and phrase, and even flow of racy narrative that he had devoted to Greek mythology and Roman love. He had hoped to dedicate the work to Augustus as a contribution to the religious restoration and as an apologetic palinode to the faith he had once scorned. The emperor gave no reason for his edict, and no one today can fathom its causes confidently. He offered some hint, however, by at the same time banishing his granddaughter Julia and ordering that Ovid's works should be removed from the public libraries. The poet had apparently played some role in Julia's misconduct, whether as witness, accomplice, or principal. He himself declared that he was punished for an error and his poems, and implied that he had been the unwilling observer of some indecent scene. He was given the remaining months of the year, that of AD 8, to arrange his affairs. The decree was relegatio, softer than exile in allowing him to retain his property, harsher in commanding him to stay in one city. He burned his manuscripts of the Metamorphoses, but some readers had made copies and preserved them. Most of his friends avoided him. A few dared the lightning by staying with him till his departure, and his wife, who remained behind at his bidding, supported him with affection and loyalty. Otherwise, Rome took no notice as the bard of its joys sailed out of Ostia on the long voyage from everything that he had loved. The sea was rough nearly all the days of that trip, and the poet thought once that the waves would engulf the vessel. When he saw Tomi, he regretted that he had survived and gave himself over to grief. On the voyage he had begun those verses which we know as tristia, sorrows. Now he continued them and sent them to his wife, his daughter, his stepdaughter, and his friends. Probably the sensitive Roman exaggerated the horrors of his new home, a treeless rock where nothing would grow, and yet shut out from the sun by the yoke she holds her favors insufficiently rewarded that in some years the snow remained all summer long, the Black Sea stiff with ice through gloomy winters, and the Danube so frozen that it offered no bar to the raids of hinterland barbarians upon the city's mixture of knife-wearing Geti and half-breed Greeks. When he thought of Roman skies and Sulmo's fields, his heart broke, and his poetry, still beautiful in form and phrase, took on a depth of feeling that it had never fathomed before. These tristia, and the poetic letters to his friends ex Ponto, from the Pontus or Black Sea, have nearly all the charms of his greater works. A simple vocabulary that made him a pleasure even in school, scenes vividly realized by insight and imagery, characters brought to life by touches of psychological subtlety, phrases compact with experience or thought, an unfailing grace of speech and flowing ease of line. All these stayed with him in his exile, attended by a seriousness and tenderness whose absence makes the earlier poems unworthy of a man. Strength of character never came to him. As once he had spoiled his verse with superficial sensuality, so now he flooded his lines with tears and suppliant adulation of the prince. He envied these poems which could go to Rome. Go, my book, and in my name greet the places I love, and the dear soil of my native land. Perhaps, he tells it, some brave friend will hand it to a relenting emperor. In every letter he still hopes for pardon, or pleads for at least some milder home. He thinks each day of his wife and calls her name in the night. He prays that he may kiss her whitened hairs before he dies. But no pardon came. After 9 years of exile, the broken man of 60 welcomed death. His bones, as he had begged, were brought to Italy and buried near the capital. His prediction of lasting fame was justified by time. His hold on the Middle Ages rivaled Virgil's. His Metamorphoses and Heroides became rich sources of medieval romance. Boccaccio and Tasso, Chaucer and Spenser drew upon him without stint, and the painters of the Renaissance had a treasure trove of subjects in his sensuous verse. He was the great romanticist of a classic age. With his passing ended one of the great flowering epochs in the history of letters. The Augustan was not a supreme literary age like the Periclean or Elizabethan. Even at its best, there is in its prose a pompous rhetoric, and in its verse a formal perfection that seldom come from soul to soul. We find no Aeschylus here, no Euripides, no Socrates, not even a Lucretius or a Cicero. Imperial patronage inspired and nourished, repressed and narrowed the literature of Rome. An aristocratic age, like that of Augustus or Louis XIV or 18th century England, exalts moderation and good taste and tends in letters to a classic style, in which reason and form dominate feeling and life. Such literature is more finished and less powerful, more mature and less influential than the literature of passionately creative periods or minds. But within the classic range, this age deserved the compliment of its name. Never had sober judgment found expression in such perfect art. Even the madcap revelry of Ovid was cooled into a classic mold. In him, and Virgil and Horace, the Latin language as a poetic medium reached its zenith. It would never be so rich and resonant, so subtle and compact, so pliant and melodious again. Chapter 13. The Other Side of Monarchy, A.D. 14 to 96. Note: all further dates will be A.D. unless otherwise noted. 1. Tiberius. When great men stoop to sentiment, the world grows fonder of them, but when sentiment governs policy, empires totter. Augustus had chosen Tiberius wisely, but too late. When Tiberius was saving the state with patient generalship, the emperor had almost loved him. "Farewell," one of his letters ended, "most agreeable of men, most valiant of men, most conscientious of commanders." Then the pathos of propinquity blinded Augustus, as later Aurelius. He set Tiberius aside for his pretty grandsons, compelled him to renounce a fortunate marriage to become the cuckold of Julia, resented his resentment, and let him grow old with philosophy in Rhodes. When at last Tiberius reached the principate, he was already 55, a disillusioned misanthrope who found no happiness in power. To understand him, we must remember that he was a Claudian. With him began the Claudian branch of that Julio-Claudian dynasty, which ended with Nero. Through both parents he inherited the proudest blood in Italy, the narrowest prejudices, the strongest will. He was tall, powerful, and well-featured, but acne accentuated his shyness, his awkward manners, his moody diffidence, and his love of seclusion. The fine head of Tiberius in the Boston Museum shows him as a young priest, with broad forehead, large deep eyes, and pensive countenance. He was so serious in youth that wags called him the old man. He received all the education that Rome, Greece, environment, and responsibility could afford. He learned the two classic languages and literatures well, wrote lyrics, dabbled in astrology, and neglected the gods. He loved his brother Drusus, despite the young man's superior popularity. He was a devoted husband to Vipsania, and so generous to his friends that they could safely give him presents in the expectation of a fourfold return. The severest as well as the ablest general of his time, he gained the admiration and affection of his soldiers because he watched over every detail of their welfare and won his battles by strategy rather than by blood. His virtues ruined him. He believed the stories told about the Mos Maiorum and wished to see the stern qualities of old Rome reborn in the new Babylon. He approved the moral reforms of Augustus and made clear his intention to enforce them. He had no liking for the ethnic farrago that steamed in the cauldron of Rome. He gave it bread but no circuses, and defended it by not attending the games presented by rich men. He was convinced that Rome could be saved from a vulgar degeneration only by an aristocracy stoic in conduct and refined in taste. But the aristocracy could no more than the people bear his stiff neck and sober countenance, his long silences and slow speech, his visible awareness of his own excellence, and, worst of all, his grim husbanding of the public funds. He had been misborn a Stoic in an Epicurean age, and he was too coldly honest to learn Seneca's art of preaching the one doctrine in beautiful language and practicing the other with graceful constancy. 4 weeks after the death of Augustus, Tiberius appeared before the Senate and asked it to restore the Republic. He was unfit, he told them, to rule so vast a state. In a city so well provided with men of illustrious character, the several departments of public business could be better filled by a coalition of the best and ablest citizens. Not daring to take him at his word, the Senate exchanged bows with him until at last he accepted power as a wretched and burdensome slavery, and in the hope that someday the Senate would permit him to retire to privacy and freedom. The play was well acted on both sides. Tiberius wanted the Principate, or he would have found some way to evade it. The Senate feared and hated him, but shrank from re-establishing a republic based, like the old, upon theoretically sovereign assemblies. It wanted less democracy, not more, and it was pleased when Tiberius, in A.D. 14, persuaded it to take over from the Comitia Centuriata the power of choosing the public officials. The citizens complained for a time, mourning the loss of the sums they had received for their votes. The only political power now left to the common man was the right of electing the emperor by assassination. After Tiberius, democracy passed from the assemblies to the army and voted with the sword. He seems to have sincerely disliked monarchy and to have considered himself the administrative head and arm of the Senate. He refused all titles that savored of royalty, contented himself with that of princeps senatus, stopped all efforts to deify or offer worship to his genius, and made evident his distaste for flattery. When the Senate wished to name a month after him, as it had done for Caesar and Augustus, he turned the compliment aside with dry humor. "What will you do if there should be 13 Caesars?" He rejected a proposal that he should revise the senatorial list. Nothing could surpass his courtesy to this ancient assembly of kings. He attended its meetings, referred even the smallest matters to its judgment, sat and spoke as merely a member, was often in the minority, and made no protest when decrees were passed contrary to his expressed opinion. He was self-contained and patient, according to Suetonius, in the face of abuse, slander, and lampoons against himself and his family. In a free country, he said, there should be freedom of speech and thought. His nominations, the hostile Tacitus admits, were made with judgment. The consuls and the praetors enjoyed the ancient honors of their rank. The subordinate officials exercised their functions free from imperial control. The laws, if we accept those of violated majesty, flowed in their regular channel. The revenues were administered by men of distinguished probity. In the provinces no new burdens were imposed, and the old duties were collected without cruelty or extortion. Good order prevailed among his slaves. In all questions of right between the emperor and individuals, the courts of justice were open, and the law decided. This Tiberian honeymoon lasted 9 years, during which Rome, Italy, and the provinces enjoyed government as good as any in their history. Without additional taxes, despite many benefactions to stricken families and cities, the careful repair of all public property, the absence of booty-yielding wars, and the rejection of bequests made to the prince by persons with children or near relatives, Tiberius, who had found 100 million sesterces in the treasury on his accession, left 2,700,000,000 there at his death. He tried to check extravagance by example rather than by law. He labored carefully on every aspect of domestic and foreign affairs. To provincial governors anxious to collect more revenues, he wrote that it was the part of a good shepherd to shear his flock, not fleece it. Though skilled in the art of war, he denied himself, as prince, the glories of the battlefield, and after the 3rd year of his long reign he kept the empire at peace. It was this pacific policy that marred the progress of his rule. His handsome and popular nephew, Germanicus, whom he had adopted as his son at Drusus's death, had won some victories in Germany and wished to go on to its conquest. Tiberius advised against it, to the disgust of the imperialistic populace. Because Germanicus was a grandson of Mark Antony, those who still dreamed of restoring the Republic used him as a symbol for their cause. When Tiberius transferred him to the east, half of Rome called the young commander a martyr to the prince's jealousy, and when Germanicus suddenly took sick and died in 19, nearly all Rome suspected that Tiberius had him poisoned. Gnaeus Piso, an appointee of Tiberius in Asia Minor, was accused of the crime and was tried by the Senate. Foreseeing condemnation, he killed himself to save his property for his family. No facts appeared to indicate Tiberius's innocence or guilt. We know only that he asked the Senate to give Piso a fair trial, and that Germanicus's mother, Antonia, remained to the end of her life the most faithful friend of Tiberius. The excited participation of the public in the celebrated case, the scurrilous tales circulated about the emperor, and the agitation now aroused against him by Germanicus's widow, Agrippina, induced Tiberius to avail himself of that Lex Julia de Majestate, or law of treason, which Caesar had passed to define crimes against the state. Since Rome had no public prosecutor or attorney general, and before Augustus no police, every citizen was empowered and requested to accuse before the courts any person whom he knew to have violated a law. If the accused was condemned, the delator or informer was awarded 1/4 of the convicted man's goods, while the state confiscated the rest. Augustus had used this dangerous procedure to enforce his marriage laws. Now, as plots multiplied against Tiberius, delatores sprang up to profit from denouncing them, and the supporters of the prince in the Senate were ready to prosecute such accusations vigorously. The emperor sought to restrain them. He interpreted the law strictly in the case of persons charged with defaming the memory or statues of Augustus, But personalities leveled against himself, says Tacitus, were to be let pass unpunished. He assured the Senate that his mother Livia wished a similar leniency shown to assailants of her good name. Livia herself was now a major problem of state. Tiberius's failure to remarry left him with no protection against a strong-minded woman accustomed to exercise authority over him. She felt that her maneuvers had cleared his way to the throne, and she gave him to understand that he held it only as her representative. During the earlier years of Tiberius's reign, though he was approaching 60, his official letters were signed by her as well as by himself. But not satisfied to rule on equal terms with him, says Dio, she wished to assert a superiority over him, and undertook to manage everything like a sole ruler. Tiberius long bore this situation patiently, but as Livia survived Augustus 15 years, he at last built himself a separate palace, and left his mother in undisputed possession of that which Augustus had raised. Gossip accused him of cruelty to her and of having starved his exiled wife. Meanwhile, Agrippina was pushing her son Nero to succeed, if possible, to replace Tiberius. This, too, he bore with hot patience, merely chiding her with a Greek quotation. "Do you think a wrong is done you, dear daughter, if you are not empress?" Hardest of all for him to bear was the realization that his only son, Drusus, born to him by his first wife, was a worthless rake, cruel, ill-mannered, and lecherous. The self-control with which Tiberius supported these tribulations left his nerves on edge. He retired more and more into himself, and developed a gloom of countenance and severity of speech that scattered all but his most hopeful friends. One man seemed unfailingly loyal to him, Lucius Aelius Sejanus. As prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Sejanus professed it his duty to protect the prince. Soon no one was admitted to the emperor's presence except through the hands and under the watch of the crafty vizier. Gradually Tiberius entrusted to him more and more of the government. Sejanus persuaded him that the imperial safety required the closer presence of the Praetorian Guard. Augustus had stationed 6 of its 9 cohorts outside the city limits. Tiberius now allowed all 9 to pitch their camp at the Viminal Gate, only a few miles from the Palatine and the capital. There they became first the protectors, then the masters of the emperors. So supported, Sejanus exercised his powers with increasing boldness and venality. He began by recommending men for office, he advanced his fortune by selling offices to the highest bidders, he ended by aspiring to the principate. A senate of real Romans would soon have overthrown him, but the senate had, with many exceptions, become an epicure's club, too listless to wield competently even the authority that Tiberius had urged it to retain. Instead of unseating Sejanus, it crowded Rome with statues voted by it in his image and honor, and at his suggestion it banished one after another of Agrippina's followers. When Tiberius's son Drusus died, Rome whispered that Sejanus had poisoned him. Overcome with disappointment and bitterness, Tiberius, now a lonely and melancholy man of 67, left the hectic capital and removed to the inaccessible privacy of Capri. But gossip followed him without impediment. People said that he wished to conceal his emaciated figure and scrofulous face, and to indulge himself in drink and unnatural vice. Tiberius drank considerably, but was no drunkard. The story of his vices was probably calumny. Most of his companions on Capri, says Tacitus, were Greeks distinguished in nothing but literature. He continued to administer carefully the affairs of the empire, except that he communicated his views and desires to officials and the Senate through Sejanus. Since the Senate increasingly feared him, or Sejanus, or the hovering guard, it accepted the wishes of the emperor as commands. And without any change in the constitution, and with no clear insincerity on Tiberius's part, the Principate became a monarchy under the man who had proposed to restore the Republic. Sejanus took advantage of his position to exile more of his enemies by having them accused under the law of majesty, and the weary emperor no longer interfered. If we may believe Suetonius, Tiberius was now often guilty of cruelty, and we have the word of the unreliable Tacitus that he asked and obtained the death penalty for Poppaeus Sabinus on the ground that spies had overheard him plot against the government. A year later, in 27, Livia died, sad and lonely in the home of her former husband. Tiberius, who had seen her but once since leaving Rome, did not attend her funeral. Freed from the restraint that the mother of her country might have exercised, Sejanus now persuaded Tiberius that Agrippina and her son Nero had been involved in the conspiracy of Sabinus. The mother was banished to Pandateria, and the son to the island of Pontia, where shortly afterward he killed himself. Having won everything else, Sejanus now reached for the throne. Irked by a letter which Tiberius had written to the Senate recommending Gaius, son of Agrippina, as successor to the principate, Sejanus formed a plot to kill the emperor in 31. Tiberius was saved by Germanicus's mother, Antonia, who risked her life to send him a warning. The old prince, not yet destitute of resolution, secretly placed a new prefect over the Praetorians, had Sejanus arrested and accused him to the Senate. Never had that body so gladly complied with the imperial wishes. It condemned Sejanus with expedition and had him strangled that very night. A reign of terror followed, led partly by senators whose interests, relatives, or friends had been injured by Sejanus, and partly by Tiberius, whom fear and anger, topping an accumulation of disillusionments, had plunged into a fury of revenge. Every important agent or supporter of Sejanus was put to death. Even his young daughter was condemned, and since the law forbade the execution of a virgin, she was first deflowered and then strangled. Apicata, his divorced wife, committed suicide, but only after she had sent Tiberius a letter assuring him that Antonia's daughter Livilla had joined with Sejanus in poisoning her husband Drusus, the emperor's son. Tiberius ordered Livilla tried, but she refused food until she died. 2 years later, in 33, Agrippina killed herself in exile, and another of her sons, having been imprisoned, starved himself to death. Tiberius lingered for 6 years after the fall of Sejanus. Probably his mind was now disordered. Only on this supposition can we explain the incredible cruelties attributed to him. We are told that he now supported instead of checked accusations for maiestas. All in all, 63 persons were indicted on this charge during his reign. He begged the Senate to provide protection for an old and lonely man. In 37, he left Capri after 9 years of self-imprisonment and visited some cities in Campania. While stopping at Lucullus's villa in Misenum, he fell in a fainting fit and seemed dead. The courtiers at once flocked about Gaius, soon to be emperor, and then were shocked to learn that Tiberius was recovering. A friend of all concerned ended the embarrassment by smothering Tiberius with a pillow. This in 37. He was, said Mommsen, the ablest ruler the empire ever had. Almost every misfortune had come to him during his life, and after his death he fell upon the pen of Tacitus. 2. Gaius. The populace celebrated the old emperor's passing with cries of Tiberius to the Tiber, and hailed the Senate's ratification of Gaius Caesar Germanicus as his successor. Born to Agrippina as she was accompanying Germanicus on his northern campaigns, Gaius had been brought up among soldiers, had imitated their dress, and had been affectionately named Caligula, or Little Boot, from the half-boot, or caliga, worn in the army. He now announced that he would follow the principles of Augustus in his policy, and would cooperate respectfully with the Senate in everything. He distributed among the citizens the 90 million sesterces that Livia and Tiberius had bequeathed them, and added a gift of 300 sesterces to each of the 200,000 recipients of state corn. He restored to the comitia the power to choose the magistrates, promised low taxes and rich games, recalled the banished victims of Tiberius, and brought his mother's ashes piously to Rome. He seemed to be in all ways the opposite of his predecessor, prodigal, cheerful, humane. Within 3 months of his accession, the people had sacrificed 160,000 victims to the gods in gratitude for so charming and beneficent a prince. They had forgotten his lineage. His father's mother was the daughter of Antony, his mother's mother was the daughter of Augustus. In his blood, the war between Antony and Octavian was renewed, and Antony won. Caligula was proud of his skill as a dueler, a gladiator, and a charioteer, but he was troubled with the falling sickness, and at times he was hardly able to walk or collect his thoughts. He hid under the bed when it thundered, and fled in terror from the sight of Etna's flames. He found it hard to sleep, and would wander through his enormous palace at night, crying for the dawn. He was tall, huge, hairy, except for a bald crown. His hollow eyes and temples made him look forbidding, to his delight. He practiced all kinds of fearsome expressions before a mirror. He had received a good schooling, was an eloquent orator, had a keen wit, and a sense of humor that knew no scruple and no law. Infatuated with the theater, he subsidized many performers and himself privately acted and danced. Desiring an audience, he summoned the leaders of the Senate, as if to some vital conference, and then displayed his steps before them. A quiet life of responsible labor might have steadied him, but the poison of power made him mad. Sanity, like government, needs checks and balances, No mortal can be omnipotent and sane. When Caligula's grandmother Antonia gave him some advice, he rebuked her with the remark, "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." In the midst of a banquet he reminded his guests that he could have them all killed where they reclined, and while embracing his wife or mistress he would say pleasantly, "Off comes this beautiful head whenever I give the word." Soon, therefore, the young prince who had been so respectful of the Senate began to give it orders and exact an oriental subservience. He let the senators kiss his feet in homage, and senators thanked him for the honor. He admired Egypt and its ways, introduced many of these to Rome, and longed to be worshipped Pharaoh-like as a god. He made the religion of Isis one of the official cults of the Roman state. He did not forget that his great-grandfather had planned to unite the Mediterranean region under an oriental monarchy. He, too, thought of making his capital at Alexandria, but distrusted the wit of its people. Suetonius describes him as living in habitual incest with all his sisters. It seemed to him an excellent Egyptian custom. Ill, he made his sister Drusilla heir to his throne. When she married, he made her divorce her husband and treated her as his lawful wife. To other desired women he sent letters of divorce in their husbands' names and invited them to his embraces. There was scarcely one woman of rank whom he did not approach. Amid these and some homosexual amours he found time for 4 marriages. Attending the wedding of Livia Orestilla and Gaius Piso, he took the bride to his own house, married her, and in a few days divorced her. Hearing that Lallia Paulina was very beautiful, he sent for her, divorced her from her husband, married her, divorced her, and forbade her to have relations with any man thereafter. His 4th wife, Caesonia, was pregnant by her husband when he married her. She was neither young nor fair, but he loved her faithfully. In this imperial frolic, government was an aside and could usually be left to inferior minds. Caligula ably revised the roster of the business class and promoted its best members to the Senate. But his extravagance soon exhausted the full treasuries left him by Tiberius. He took his baths not in water but in perfumes. On one banquet he spent 10 million sesterces. He built great pleasure barges with colonnades, banquet halls, baths, gardens, fruit trees, and gem-set sterns. He had his engineers span Baia's Bay with a bridge resting on so many boats that Rome suffered famine for lack of ships to import corn. When the bridge was completed, a great celebration took place, illuminated by floodlights in the modern manner. The people drank merrily, boats overturned, and many were drowned. From the roof of the Basilica Julia he would scatter gold and silver coins among the people below and watch with glee their fatal scrambling. He was so devoted to the green faction at the races that he gave a charioteer 2 million sesterces. He built a marble stall and an ivory manger for the racehorse Insiditus, invited it to dinner, and proposed to make it consul. To raise funds for his lifelong Saturnalia, Caligula restored the custom of presenting gifts to the emperor. He accepted these in person on his palace terrace from all who came to give. He encouraged citizens to name him heir in their wills. He levied taxes upon everything: a sales tax on all food, a tax on all legal processes, a 12.5% tax on the wages of porters. On the earnings of prostitutes, Suetonius avers, he laid a tax of as much as each received for one embrace, and the law provided that those who had ever been prostitutes should remain subject to this tax even after they married. He had rich men accused of treason and condemned to death as an aid to the treasury. He personally auctioned off gladiators and slaves, and forced aristocrats to attend and bid. When one of these slept, Caligula interpreted his nods as bids, so that the sleeper, waking, found himself richer by 13 gladiators and poorer by 9 million sesterces. He compelled senators and knights to fight as gladiators in the arena. After 3 years, a conspiracy was formed to end this humiliating buffoonery. Caligula detected it and revenged himself by a reign of terror enhanced by his manic joy in inflicting pain. The executioners were instructed to kill his victims by numerous slight wounds, so that they may feel that they are dying. If we may believe Dio Cassius, he forced his saintly grandmother Antonia to kill herself. Suetonius recounts that when meat ran short for feeding the beasts kept for gladiatorial games, Caligula ordered all bald-headed prisoners to be fed to the animals for the public good. That he had men of high rank branded with irons, condemned to mines, thrown to beasts, or shut up in caves and then sawn in two. These are stories that we have no means of disproving and must record as the tradition. But Suetonius loved gossip, the senator Tacitus hated the emperors, and Dio Cassius wrote 2 centuries after the event. More credible is the report that Caligula began the war between the Principate and philosophy by exiling Corinus Secundus and sentencing 2 other teachers to death. The young Seneca was marked for execution, but was spared because he was sickly and might be relied upon to die without prodding. Claudius, uncle of Caligula, escaped because he was, or pretended to be, an insignificant, book-ridden dolt. Caligula's final pleasantry was to announce himself as a god, equal to Jupiter himself. Famous statues of Jove and other deities were decapitated and crowned with heads of the emperor. He enjoyed sitting on a throne in the temple of Castor and Pollux and receiving divine worship. At times he would converse with an image of Jupiter, often in terms of reproof. And he had a contrivance made by which he could reply to Jove's thunder and lightning, peal for peal and stroke for stroke. He set up a temple to his godhead, with a corps of priests and a supply of select victims, and he appointed his favorite horse as one of the priests. He pretended that the moon goddess had come down to embrace him, and asked Vitellius could he not see her. "No," answered that wise courtier, "only you gods can see one another." The people were not deceived. When a Gallic cobbler saw Caligula masquerading as Jupiter and was asked what he thought of the emperor, he said simply, "A big humbug." Caligula heard but did not punish such refreshing courage. At 29, this god was an old man, worn out by excesses, probably venereally diseased, with a small and half-bald head upon a fat body, with a livid complexion, hollow eyes, and a sinister glance. His fate came suddenly, and from that Praetorian guard whose support he had long purchased with gifts. A tribune of the guard, Cassius Chaerea, insulted by the obscenities that Caligula gave him as passwords day after day, killed him in a secret passage of the palace in 41. When the news went out, the city hesitated to believe it. Men feared that this was a trick of the imperial prankster to find out who would rejoice at his death. To clarify the issue, the assassins killed Caligula's final wife and dashed out his daughter's brains against a wall. On that day, says Dio, Caligula learned that he was not a god. 3. Claudius. Caligula had left the empire in a dangerous condition, the treasury empty, the Senate decimated, the people alienated. Mauritania in rebellion, Judea in arms at his insistence on placing his cult statue in the Temple of Jerusalem. No one knew where to find a ruler fit to face these problems. The Praetorians, coming upon the apparently imbecile Claudius hiding in a corner, proclaimed him imperator. The Senate, in terror of the army and perhaps relieved by the prospect of dealing with a harmless pedant instead of a reckless lunatic, confirmed the choice of the guard, and Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus hesitantly mounted the throne. He was the son of Antonia and Drusus, the brother of Germanicus and Livilla, the grandson of Octavia and Antony, of Livia and Tiberius Claudius Nero. He had been born at Lugdunum, or Lyon, in the year 10 B.C., and was now 50 years old. He was tall and stout, with white hair and an amiable face, but infantile paralysis and other diseases had weakened his frame. His legs were precariously thin and gave him a shambling gait. His head wobbled as he walked. He loved good wines and rich food and suffered from gout. He stuttered a bit, and his laughter seemed too boisterous for an emperor. In anger, says the merciless gossiper, he would foam at the mouth and trickle at the nose. He had been brought up by women and freedmen, had developed a timidity and sensitivity hardly advantageous to a ruler, and had had few opportunities to practice government. His relatives had looked upon him as a feeble-minded invalid. His mother, who had inherited Octavia's gentleness, called him an unfinished monster, and when she wished to stress a man's dullness, she would term him a bigger fool than my Claudius. Scorned by all, he lived in safe obscurity, absorbed in gambling, books, and drink. He became a philologist and antiquarian, learned in ancient art, religion, science, philosophy, and law. He wrote histories of Etruria, Carthage, and Rome, treatises on dice and the alphabet, a Greek comedy, and an autobiography. Scientists and savants corresponded with him and dedicated their tomes to him. Pliny the Elder cites him 4 times as an authority. As emperor, he told his people how to cure snakebite, and forestalled superstitious fears by predicting a solar eclipse on his birthday and explaining its cause. He spoke Greek well, and wrote several of his works in that language. He had a good mind, Perhaps he was sincere when he told the Senate that he had pretended stupidity in order to save his head. His first act as emperor was to reward with a donative of 15,000 sesterces every soldier of that guard which had raised him to the throne. Caligula had given such gifts, but not so clearly in payment for the empire. Now Claudius acknowledged the sovereignty of the army while cancelling again the power of the assembly to choose the magistrates. With wiser generosity he ended accusations de majestate, released persons imprisoned on such charges, recalled all exiles, restored confiscated property, returned to Greece the statues that Gaius had stolen, and abolished the taxes that Gaius had introduced. But he put to death Caligula's assassins on the theory that it was unsafe to condone the murder of an emperor. He ended the practice of prostration and announced simply that he was not to be worshipped as a god. Like Augustus, he repaired the temples and with antiquarian fervor sought to reanimate the old religion. He applied himself personally and conscientiously to public affairs. He even made the rounds of those who sold goods and let buildings, and corrected whatever he deemed to be abuses. But in truth, though he emulated the moderation of Augustus, his actual policies went beyond that cautious conservatism to the bold and varied plans of Caesar. The reform of government and law, the construction of public works and services, the elevation of the provinces, the enfranchisement of Gaul, and the conquest and Romanization of Britain. He surprised everyone by showing will and character as well as learning and intellect. Like Caesar and Augustus, he was convinced that the local magistrates were too few and untrained, the Senate too proud and impatient to do the complex work of municipal and imperial administration. He bowed to the Senate and left it many powers and more dignities, but the real labor of government was performed by himself, a cabinet of his appointees, and a civil service gradually organized, as under Caesar, Augustus, and Tiberius, out of the freedmen of the emperor's household, and using public slaves for clerical and minor tasks. 4 cabinet members headed this bureaucracy: a secretary of state, ab epistulus, for communications, a treasurer, a rationibus, for accounts, another secretary, a libellus, for petitions, and an attorney general, a cognitionibus, for actions at law. Able freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, held the first 3 posts. Their rise to power and wealth was the symbol of a wide elevation of the freedman class, which had been going on for centuries and reached a new height in Claudius's reign. When the aristocracy protested against the empowerment of these parvenus, Claudius revived the office of censor, had himself chosen to it, revised the list of persons eligible to the Senate, eliminated the chief opponents of his policies, and added new members from the knights and the provinces. Equipped with these administrative organs, he set himself an ambitious program of construction and reform. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.